I never imagined that the smell of roses could carry so much sorrow. People say roses mean love, but in my case, they also mean grief memory and quiet defiance. I sit here now in this little garden. I planted myself, the sun warming my shoulders through the late spring breeze. The roses have bloomed again. They always do. Reliable, fragrant, and patient. Today, I'm sipping chamomile tea from a chipped blue mug, one I bought for 50 cents at a yard sale. My hands are older now, knotted in places where they used to be smooth. But they still know how to prune a rosebush without flinching. And they still remember. That's the thing about hands, they hold memory deeper than even the mind sometimes. I often talk to the camera like this. My son Marcus says it makes me look like a grandma influencer, whatever that means. I just like the thought of anyone sitting across from me with a cup of tea, hearing my voice, and feeling less alone. So if you're watching or listening, I want to ask you something before we begin. What's your favorite flower? Is it wild like daisies or regal like lilies? Mine's the rose, though not for the reasons people think. You see, this story I'm about to share. It begins and ends in a garden. But not this one. Not the humble patch of peace behind a white cottage in Oregon. No, it began in a much grander place. A house with white columns, 3 chimneys, and a wrought iron gate that locked with a click too sharp for comfort. I was born in 1950 in Branford, Connecticut. Only child. My father, Benjamin Whitmore, was a banker with kind eyes and a fondness for crossword puzzles. My mother, Lillian, taught piano to children in town and sang to herself while folding laundry. We weren't flashy rich, but we had what my father called solid heritage. The kind of family that kept ledgers and planted oak trees for grandchildren not yet born. Our home had a library with real leather-bound books, a grand staircase, and a rose garden just off the southern wing. My mother planted it the year I turned 5. She let me name the bushes Clementine, Ruby Gloria, even one I called Cloud, because its petals were so pale they looked like snow. When I was little, I thought the world was made of music and stories and days where nothing ever really changed. But it did. When I was 14, my parents boarded a flight to Chicago for a banking conference. It was early September 1964. I still remember the way my mother kissed my forehead and reminded me to water the roses, especially Cloud, who had been looking a bit dull. My father winked and said he'd bring me back a book. That was the last time I saw them. Their plane went down somewhere in Indiana. Bad weather. Mechanical failure, they said. Everyone on board was lost. Just like that, I became an orphan with a fortune. It's strange how quickly grief is interrupted by paperwork. There were lawyers, distant cousins, people I didn't recognize coming in and out of the house, all whispering when they thought I couldn't hear. But I did hear. I heard everything. It was decided by whom I'm still not sure that my father's brother Richard would become my legal guardian. Uncle Richard. He and his wife Martha moved into the house before the funeral flowers had even wilted. They smiled a lot. She brought me soup and patted my hand, saying things like, "You're so brave, and we'll take care of everything now." He stood tall in father's suits and said things like, "We must respect the family's name, and let's not dwell on tragedy." I didn't know what to feel then. Numbness is a powerful blanket. I let them arrange things. Let them tuck me into bed. Let them take over the mail. I stopped writing letters to my best friend Lucy after a few weeks, not because I forgot her, but because she never replied. Years later, I found out she never received them. But back then, I just thought, maybe grief made people forget. There's a stillness that settles in a house when the people you love are gone. Even when others move in. Even when there's the sound of new shoes on marble floors and the smell of unfamiliar cologne. Something stays hollow, and you start to listen for ghosts. I used to sit by the rose garden alone in those early days. The bushes went untended. Martha said roses were too finicky and preferred hydrangeas. But I tried to keep at least a few alive. I couldn't save them all. That's where I would sit, knees curled under me, staring at the iron gate at the edge of the property, wondering if I could run, wondering who would take in a girl like me with money I couldn't touch and a future already being carved by other people's hands. Sometimes I dreamed my parents were just away on a longer trip, that they'd walk through the gate any moment, father with a new book, mother smelling faintly of gardenia and sunlight. But they never did, and so began the story I never told. Not fully, not until now. Because truth, like roses, sometimes needs time. Time to take root. Time to bloom through stone and memory. So, if you're still with me, still listening, pour another cup of tea. The next part of my story doesn't have roses. Not for a long while. But it does have thorns. I used to write letters to my best friend Lucy every single Sunday. Always after lunch, always with my favorite blue pen. That little ritual began when we were 8 and kept going like a heartbeat, steady and comforting. Even when my parents were away, even when I caught the flu one winter and could barely sit up, I still wrote. Lucy lived just a few miles down the road, but we treated our letters like treasure. We'd fold in pressed flowers, tiny poems, silly drawings. I once sent her a string from my dress hem because she said it was the prettiest green she'd ever seen. She mailed me back a chocolate coin she'd forgotten under her bed. That was our friendship, odd, warm, full of laughter that stretched across lined paper. After the funeral, I remember sitting at my desk by the window, staring at the empty stationery box my mother had bought for me in Boston. It had tiny golden initials, EGW. I remember tracing the letters with my finger, then picking up my pen. I told Lucy everything in that letter. I told her how strange the house felt, how my new guardian and his wife had moved in like guests who never planned to leave. I asked if she'd come visit. I asked her to bring ginger snaps. I even asked if she still remembered our secret code, a silly pattern we made up so her older brother wouldn't read our notes. I left the letter in the usual basket near the front door. That was the rule, leave the letter in the basket, and James the driver would post it the next morning. But the next week, I didn't get a reply, or the week after that. At first, I thought maybe she was busy, or maybe her family had taken a trip. But then it became 3 weeks, then 4. I wrote again, a shorter note this time, just a line. Are you all right? Still nothing. One morning, I came down to the kitchen and saw Martha flipping through the mail. She had a habit of humming tunelessly, her lipstick always a touch too red for mornings. I saw my envelope recognizable in my shaky cursive tucked beneath a pile she slid into the side drawer. I asked her gently, did Lucy write back? She looked up almost startled. Oh, no, darling, I don't think so. But I saw I began. She closed the drawer softly. Sometimes it's better not to stir old habits. We're doing everything we can to keep your life calm, dear. Grief makes things messy. You don't need distractions right now. That was the first time I felt it. Not sadness, not even fear. Just displacement. Like someone had quietly moved the furniture in my mind, and I couldn't find the door anymore. Later that afternoon, Uncle Richard called me into the study. He sat behind my father's desk, his fingers steepled like he'd practiced it. Eleanor, he said, we've decided that for the time being, it would be wise to manage your correspondence. Your mind needs time to rest. No need for outside noise while you're adjusting. I'm not broken, I said quietly. He didn't flinch. No. But you are vulnerable. And as your guardian, it's my responsibility to protect your best interests. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I nodded. And that's when the letters stopped. From then on, I wrote only in my diary. I kept it under my mattress, a cloth-bound little thing with a broken spine. I didn't write in code. I wrote plainly because no one was reading it but me. The days started to blend together. Richard's voice became the hallway echo. Martha's perfume filled the corners. I wasn't allowed to go back to school. Martha told the neighbors it was because I needed special tutoring at home. She said it kindly, even smiled, as she said it as if I'd somehow been given a gift. My lessons consisted of light etiquette piano scales and silent meals. No literature, no history, nothing that asked questions, nothing that made me wonder. I began to forget the rhythm of the world beyond the gates. There was one day, though, when Lucy came. She rode her bike up the gravel path, her curls flying wild in the wind. I saw her from the upstairs window pressing the bell with both hands, looking around nervously. But no one opened the door. I rushed down the stairs barefoot, nearly slipping on the polished wood. By the time I reached the front hall, the door was already closed again. Martha stood beside it, holding a tea towel. Her face was unreadable. "There's no need to open the door to surprises," she said simply. I remember pressing my palm to the cold glass, watching Lucy pedal away with confusion written all over her shoulders. That night, I sat in the rose garden staring at the gate. It hadn't opened in days, weeks, maybe months. I started counting how many birds I saw each morning. I gave them names. I found ways to fold time into small patterns, like napkins pressed tight into drawers. If I could contain the quiet, maybe it wouldn't swallow me whole. But the silence, once it takes root, grows fast. One evening, I heard the housekeeper whisper to the cook, "Poor child. Living in a mansion and starving for a voice." I turned away before they could see me listening. Because even then, I knew when your words are taken, you learn to live in gesture, in small glances, in the tilt of your head, in the way you leave the curtains slightly parted, hoping the wind brings in something different. That was the winter I stopped writing letters. But not because I had nothing to say. It was because I knew finally that no one was reading. He didn't knock. He never knocked. Julian simply appeared one morning, the wheels of his chair creaking softly across the tiled foyer, as if the house had always belonged to him. I was sitting at the end of the hallway, tracing a crack along the baseboard with my toe, when I heard the sound, slow, steady, and unfamiliar. I looked up, and there he was, halfway across the marble floor, his pale hands gripping the wheels, his shoulders hunched like the world owed him something. He stopped in front of the grand mirror and looked at himself for a long moment before speaking. "You're the girl, aren't you?" he said, his voice rough like gravel, but not unkind. "The one with the locked drawers and sad eyes." I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. He tilted his head and smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "No need to answer. I've already been told everything about you." That was my introduction to Julian Whitmore, son of Richard and Martha, and the last living heir of a family that seemed more interested in legacy than in love. He had returned from Boston after a long recovery from an accident, one that had left his legs paralyzed, and it seemed his patience worn thin. They gave him the room across from mine. The doors opened wide for his chair, and they hired a private nurse who barely spoke above a whisper. Julian dismissed her within a week. Said she smelled like pity. At first, I hardly saw him. He stayed in his room for days, curtains-drawn radio, humming some low jazz tune. But I could feel him in the air, the sharpness, the awareness. As if I were no longer alone in my silence. He had brought his own. And then, little by little, he started to appear. In the dining room at odd hours. In the hallway, when I thought I was the only one wandering. In the library, where I had once found solace, but now found judgment. "You read too much," he said one evening, rolling up beside me as I tucked a volume of Dickinson beneath a pillow. "That's what they say, don't they? That girls who read too much forget how to live." I kept my eyes on the fireplace. "And boys who don't read forget how to think." He barked a laugh, not cruel, just surprised. "Touché," he said, then wheeled himself away. That became a pattern. Brief conversations wrapped in sarcasm, comments too clever to be careless. But there was something beneath it, something raw and biting. Julian wasn't just bitter. He was broken. And unlike me, he didn't bother hiding the cracks. Sometimes I wondered what he had been like before the accident. Martha once mentioned over breakfast that Julian had been spirited. Richard called him a force of nature. But I only knew the version that rolled through corridors like a shadow looking for something to lash out at. One night, I tried to use the house phone. It had been months since I'd spoken to anyone outside. I waited until the hallways were quiet and crept down the stairs barefoot, careful not to make the floorboards sigh. The phone was tucked inside the walnut cabinet near the front parlor. I dialed Lucy's number from memory, my heart pounding like it used to on spelling bee days. It rang once, twice. Then I heard the click, not from the other end of the line, but behind me. Julian sat in the dark, just beyond the archway, his chair silent this time, his face half lit by moonlight. "Who are you calling?" he asked, voice low. I dropped the receiver, startled. "No one," I said, just listening to the dial tone. He stared at me for a moment that felt too long. "You're a terrible liar," he said finally. "I like that." The next morning, the phone cord had been cut. I asked Martha about it casually while she was pruning the indoor ferns. "Oh," she said with a smile, "it must have frayed with age." "Not to worry, dear. We don't need outside calls for now." I nodded. But something in me curled up that day, a small piece of trust that decided never to grow back. Julian grew bolder after that. He asked more questions, some harmless others, not. "What's it like knowing everything you have was bought with someone else's death?" he asked once. I froze. "I didn't buy it," I said softly. "No. But you're wearing it?" He replied, his eyes flicking toward the ring I wore around my neck, my father's signet strung on a ribbon. There were moments rare and fleeting when I thought he might understand what it meant to lose everything without warning. But those moments passed quickly, replaced by the cold reality that Julian didn't want company in his misery, he wanted an audience. One afternoon, I overheard something I wasn't meant to. Richard was on the phone in the study, the door slightly ajar. I had come down for tea, but the words stopped me cold in the hallway. "She'll be 18 in April," he said, his tone clipped. "We'll arrange something small, private, no press, just signatures." A pause. "No, she doesn't know. But she won't resist. If she does, we have documentation. Enough to declare emotional instability. You understand?" My heart raced. I backed away slowly, each breath heavier than the last. I didn't need to hear more. They weren't raising me. They were grooming me for something I hadn't agreed to, a future I hadn't chosen. That night, I sat in the dark corner of the library and cried without sound. The house around me slept indifferent. Somewhere across the hall, Julian turned off his radio, and in the stillness that followed, I realized something chilling. This wasn't a home anymore. It was a waiting room, and they were counting the days. Some doors aren't locked with keys. They're locked with secrets. That's what I came to understand about the study, the room that used to smell like cedar and ink and my father's cologne. After his death, Uncle Richard took it over. At first, I avoided it out of grief. It hurt to see someone else sitting behind my father's desk, flipping through papers like they meant nothing. But as months passed and the silence in the house thickened, that room began to hum with suspicion. Richard kept it locked most of the time, but sometimes he forgot. Or maybe he thought I was too well trained to explore. I wasn't. One afternoon, around the end of February, I noticed the door ajar. Just an inch, enough to tempt. The hallway was quiet. Martha had taken her tea upstairs. Julian was out back berating the gardener for trimming the hedges unevenly. I slipped inside, heart pounding like it used to when I played hide-and-seek as a child. Only now, no one was looking for me. Or maybe that was the point, they were watching me all the time. The study looked both familiar and foreign. The bookshelves remained row upon row of leather-bound titles my father loved. But the warmth was gone. The curtains were always closed now, the fireplace unlit. Dust collected along the edges of the globe in the corner, the one he used to spin when telling me bedtime stories about cities he'd never visited. What caught my eye wasn't anything grand. It was a simple wooden box tucked beneath a stack of ledgers. Inside, old correspondence notes, a broken pair of reading glasses, and a folded paper labeled private for future review. I shouldn't have opened it. I knew that. But I did. Inside was a draft document typed, signed in pencil, but not notarized. A guardianship clause. It included language that made my stomach drop. In the event of behavioral instability or inability to manage personal property, the minor may remain under extended supervision beyond age 18. My fingers trembled. It was dated months prior, right after my parents' death. A sound in the hallway startled me. I returned the paper hastily and slipped out, barely pulling the door closed behind me. I walked back to my room and shut the door with a soft click, pressing my back against it. Later that evening, I noticed a cup of tea waiting on my bedside table. Martha had taken to bringing me chamomile every night. She said it was for sleep. Lately, I'd been sleeping longer, waking groggy times slipping like soap through my hands. I took the cup, turned it in my palm, and placed it back without drinking. That was the first night I didn't sleep. The next morning, I asked Martha when I could return to school. She gave me that practiced smile, the one that didn't quite reach her eyes, and said, "Oh, Eleanor. We've talked about this. The environment there isn't nurturing right now. The tutors will continue. And really, dear, at your age, does it matter?" It did matter. It mattered deeply. Books had become my only window. The only proof the outside world still existed. But even that was starting to feel monitored. Once I found a page torn from my journal. I never mentioned it. Never asked. I began hiding my thoughts deeper. I wrote in code. Small phrases only I could untangle. I slipped diary pages into the spines of unused encyclopedias. Sometimes I recited sentences silently before bed like prayers. One Thursday, the doctor returned. He was tall and thin, with spectacles always sliding down his nose and a polite smile that didn't quite fit the room. Dr. Williamson, a family acquaintance. My father had respected him. That day, he carried a brown case and sat across from me in the drawing room. "How are you sleeping, Eleanor?" "Fine. Any sadness, nightmares?" I shrugged. "Nothing unusual." He took notes. "Your guardians say you've been withdrawn. Would you agree?" I stared at him, searching for malice. But there was none. Only routine. "I don't think I've changed," I said carefully. "I think the house did." He blinked. "Wrote that down too." Later, I heard him and Richard talking quietly in the foyer. "She's composed," the doctor said, "but I'd keep an eye on her moods. She holds things in." "She always has," Richard replied. "We just want to make sure she's manageable." Manageable. That word stayed with me, echoing through the halls, slipping beneath doors. One morning, I returned to the study when I knew everyone had gone to church. I opened drawers, flipped through folders. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I knew I had to find it before they found a way to seal my fate permanently. Behind the bookshelf, where the paneling warped slightly, I found another folder. This one included a list of future legal steps typed and annotated in Martha's careful cursive. Among them, schedule psychiatric reevaluation by June, explore trust conversion into spousal co-ownership, secure marriage certificate discreet. There was one line circled 3 times. Should Eleanor refuse initiate legal incompetency via Dr. W. I sat down on the floor, my back against the wood, the paper shaking in my hands. They had planned this, all of it. It wasn't just about guardianship. It wasn't just about control. They were going to take away my name, my rights, my very capacity to speak for myself, unless I became a wife. A wife to Julian. I left the study and returned to my room. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I folded the paper into my shoe for safekeeping, and for the first time in months, I opened the window wide. I looked out at the sky, gray and dull, and whispered into the breeze, "I will not disappear." Birthdays are supposed to feel like freedom. Mine felt like a sentence. It was a gray morning in April. No rain, no sun, just that kind of sky that looks undecided. The house was quiet when I woke, but not peacefully so. It was the kind of quiet that presses down on your skin. Something waited in it. I sat up slowly in bed and noticed a dress hanging on the door. Cream silk, modest neckline, lace sleeves, too formal for breakfast, too plain for a party. And beside it on the dresser, a small envelope with my name in Martha's careful script, Eleanor G. Whitmore. Inside was a single line, "Happy 18th, darling. Please wear this by 10 a.m. No signature, no explanation, just expectation. I stared at that dress for a long time. Something in me already knew. Still, I bathed, dressed, brushed my hair into a soft twist. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't recognize the girl staring back. She looked like someone in a photograph from decades ago, framed and silent. Downstairs, the dining room was set with silver. A small cake sat at the center of the table. Pink frosting, no candles, no music, no guests. Richard stood when I entered. He looked polished, composed, and oddly congratulatory. Martha kissed my cheek and handed me a box. "Your mother would have wanted you to have this today," she said softly. Inside was a ring. Gold with a tiny ruby embedded in the center. It wasn't my mother's. I knew every piece of her jewelry by heart. This was not one of them. I looked up confused, but they were already smiling too widely for questions. Julian rolled in, then dressed in a charcoal suit. His hair slicked back, his hands resting lightly on the arms of his chair. "Nice dress," he said flatly. "It almost makes you look willing." I flinched. Richard cleared his throat. "We thought a small ceremony would be appropriate. Just family, quiet, dignified." I swallowed hard. Ceremony. Martha touched my arm. "Marriage, dear. It's time." I looked at them, all their faces so calm, like this had always been the plan. Maybe it had. "I didn't agree to this," I said, voice tight. Richard's eyes hardened just slightly. "You didn't have to. We've consulted legal counsel, and Dr. Williamson's notes support the concern that prolonged resistance to structure may indicate emotional volatility." My breath caught. The room swayed. "You said I was grieving." "You were. But prolonged grief, Eleanor, left unchecked, can become dangerous. To your legacy, to yourself." Martha smiled, but her eyes had gone cold. "We're protecting you, sweetheart. And this is what your parents would have wanted for you to be safe, provided for." Julian made a small, amused sound. "Let's not pretend this is about love." They all ignored him. An hour later, I stood in the parlor, its windows drawn light dimmed, and faced a reverend I had never met before. He barely looked at me, just read the vows in a neutral tone like reading a menu. I couldn't speak. Martha gently pressed the ring into my hand. "Just place it on his finger, dear." Julian held out his hand, palm limp, eyes steady. I slid the ring on. The Reverend turned to Julian. "Do you, Julian Thomas Whitmore, take Eleanor Grace Whitmore as your lawful wife?" "I do," he said without blinking. "And do you, Eleanor Grace Whitmore?" "She does," Richard interrupted. The Reverend paused, glanced at Richard, then back at me. I stared at the floor. My voice had abandoned me. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," he finished, uncertain. "May God bless your union." There was no kiss, no applause, just the sound of paper being signed and filed away. Later that afternoon, I sat on the edge of my bed, still in the dress. The ring felt too tight. My hands felt wrong, as if they no longer belonged to me. A knock on the door. Julian entered without waiting. He looked at me for a moment. "We did it," he said flatly. "You're mine now, technically." I didn't reply. He wheeled closer. "They say this makes everything easier. For everyone." I looked at him then. Really looked. Beneath his cruelty was something jagged like glass. Not pity, not pain, just damage left too long in the dark. "I'm not a thing," I said softly. He blinked. "Aren't you?" Then he left the sound of his wheels scraping the rug like a warning. That night, I took off the ring and placed it in a drawer. I locked the drawer with the tiny key I had kept since I was 10, the one that used to open my music box. The box was gone now, but the key still turned. Outside, the wind knocked against the window pane. Somewhere in the house, a door creaked. Or maybe it was just the house shifting, adjusting to its new shape. I lay down, fully dressed, shoes still on, and stared at the ceiling for hours. And in that long, silent night, I made myself one quiet promise. They had taken my name, but I would not let them take my voice. There's no clock in that room. Time didn't pass, it lingered. After the wedding, they moved me into the west bedroom. Not mine, not Julian's. A new space, neutral, impersonal beige walls, and white linens without warmth. It smelled like lemon oil and silence. A room meant for someone who wouldn't question anything. A room where no one asked how you felt. Julian stayed across the hall. We weren't expected to act like a couple, at least not in the way stories told it. There were no shared dinners, no wedding portrait, no whispers in the dark. But the arrangement suited them and him. He had gotten what he needed: legal proximity to the estate, the family name secure, and a convenient silence sewn around the entire affair. They didn't need me to be a wife. They just needed me to stay put. At first, I tried to hold on to routines. I woke early, dressed neatly, combed my hair, and opened the curtains. I read when I could. I wrote when I dared. But day by day, the rhythm unraveled. Martha took over my meals. She said it was simpler if the cook prepared something light and left it at the door. No need for formal dining, she said. It was better this way. I stopped seeing Richard altogether. He traveled often now. Julian called it estate business. I called it cowardice. As for Julian, he drifted in and out like fog. Some days I'd hear his voice rising sharply at staff complaining about tea that was too hot, towels folded incorrectly, hedges trimmed too short. Other days I wouldn't see him at all. When we did cross paths, he often offered comments like, "Dart's reading again. You look pale. Still not talking, I see." He enjoyed reminding me of my quietness, as if it proved something about him. Or about me. One afternoon, I found him in the library. He had rolled up to the window, gazing out at the barren rose garden. Without turning, he said, "You know they say silence is dignified, but I think it's just another form of surrender." I didn't respond. He turned his chair slowly to face me. "Or maybe it's strategy," he added. "Maybe you're more dangerous than you look." I held his gaze for just a moment before walking away. That night, I dreamed of my mother's hands, soft and warm, brushing my hair. In the dream, I reached for her, but she kept fading. Every time I opened my mouth to call her name, the sound dissolved. When I awoke, I couldn't remember the last time I'd spoken out loud. The house grew colder. Winter came early that year, and the radiators groaned like old bones. My window frosted at the corners, and I took to writing words with my fingertip in the glass, just to see something vanish and reappear. Once I wrote home and stared at it until the frost melted. There were staff, of course. Housekeepers, gardeners, cooks. But none dared speak more than necessary. I heard rumors, quiet ones, that those who got too close to me didn't stay long. One girl, Anna, had left me a book beside my tea tray, a collection of poems by Emily Bronte. Inside was a note for the quiet hours. "Stay warm." She was gone by morning. No explanation, no goodbye. That was the day I stopped accepting kindness from strangers. Even the library, once my sanctuary, began to feel haunted. The books still waited patiently, but I read them differently now. Words of longing, defiance, grief, they weren't metaphors anymore. They were maps. I started journaling again, this time on scrap paper receipts, anything I could hide between book spines and chair cushions. I didn't write for therapy. I wrote to survive. To remind myself that thoughts still lived behind my eyes, but even thoughts grew heavy after a while. Some evenings, I'd lie flat on the floor, staring at the ceiling, wondering if anyone would notice if I vanished. Would the garden bloom without me? Would the light change? Would the silence shift? Julian didn't hit me. He didn't shout. But what he did was quieter, meaner. He called me the house ghost, told staff I floated, not walked, left dead flowers on my dresser once. For your charm, he said. One day, he found a page of my journal left under the cushion of the armchair in the music room. He didn't say anything right away. But that evening after dinner, I returned to my room and found it waiting on my pillow. Burnt, curled edges, black flakes, and one sentence still legible. Even silence has teeth. He had underlined it in red. I didn't cry. Instead, I took the ashes and folded them into a handkerchief. I carried them in my pocket for weeks, like a warning I refused to forget. One cold night, I snuck into the library again. The house slept in long, shallow breaths. I lit the lamp, pulled out a notebook hidden behind a row of Russian novels, and wrote just 2 words, "Not done." Then I closed the book and placed it back behind Tolstoy. That was the moment I realized something had shifted. I was still here, still writing, still thinking. They could starve my days and cloud my name, but they hadn't erased me yet. I wasn't thriving, not by any stretch. But I wasn't broken either, not completely. And in a house designed to hollow me out, that felt like a rebellion. The only door they forgot to lock was the one lined with books. It was strange, really. They had stripped me of almost everything: my name, my choices, my right to speak without consequence. But the library remained untouched. Maybe because Richard believed books couldn't cause trouble. Or maybe because Julian thought knowledge was useless if no one listened to you. But I listened. To every page. The library had once been my father's favorite room. I remembered him sitting in the leather armchair by the window, spectacles low on his nose, a teacup balanced on the edge of a novel. He'd say things like, "History is only ever borrowed," or "The person who controls the story controls the world." At 14, I had thought that was just poetic. At 21, I understood it was prophetic. The first time I returned to the room after my marriage, I expected it to be cold, distant, haunted. But it welcomed me like an old friend, quiet, worn, and patiently waiting. I went late at night, always, after Julian had gone to bed. I learned how to move through the house without being heard: bare feet, soft breaths, body close to the walls. I never turned on the overhead lights. Just the small lamp in the corner near the mahogany shelf with the green-bound volumes. At first, I just sat. No reading, no writing, just being, breathing. But after a while, I started to touch the spines. Lightly. Like brushing the fingers of old acquaintances. I found books I hadn't read since I was a child: Black Beauty, Little Women, Anne of Green Gables. Each one a thread back to the girl I had once been. One night, I found my mother's poetry collection. It was a slim, pale blue book with her initials embossed in gold on the cover. Inside was an inscription: "To Lillian, whose voice turns silence into song." I ran my fingers over the words and cried for the first time in weeks. I began to rebuild myself in that room. I chose a shelf near the window and called it my garden. Each book I added was a seed. I placed folded notes inside the pages, quotes, questions, even memories. Tiny rebellions no one would see. I started a new journal hidden behind the Russian literature section. I titled it, "The Second Life of Eleanor Whitmore." It felt bold, even foolish. But I needed to believe a second life was possible. The library gave me language again. I studied the law books my father had once kept. I traced underlined passages about guardianship, inheritance, spousal rights. I began to understand the cage I lived in, not just emotional, but legal. That knowledge did not set me free, but it sharpened me. And with each word I read, I grew heavier. Not in despair, but in quiet weight. Like stone. Like something rooted. One evening, while flipping through Persuasion, I found a pressed flower between the pages, a rose petal browned at the edges, fragile as tissue. I didn't know if it was hers or mine, but it reminded me I had lived before the silence. Then something unexpected happened. Julian began to linger outside the library. At first, I thought it was coincidence. a creak in the hallway, a shadow across the glass. But one night, I saw him parked just beyond the doorway watching. He didn't speak, just sat there, like a sentinel. Or maybe a ghost. I ignored him. The next day, the lamp had been moved an inch to the left. The day after that, the green-bound books had been straightened. He was coming in, but he never touched my shelf. I didn't know what game he was playing, or if it was a game at all. Maybe he too had started to feel the ache of the silence. Maybe watching me read reminded him of something human inside himself. Or maybe he just wanted to remind me that even in the one space I thought was mine, he could be present. Still, I didn't stop going. One night, I found something. Behind the lower bookshelf near the floor, a small panel had warped from age. I tugged it free and discovered a hollow space. Inside was an envelope yellowed and sealed with wax long broken. It was addressed in my father's handwriting. To Eleanor, in the event I cannot be with you. My breath caught. Hands shaking, I opened it. Inside were 3 sheets of paper. The first was a letter. The second, a list of trusted contacts, lawyers, friends, associates. The third was a copy of a supplemental clause from his original will, one that had been crossed out and replaced in later versions, possibly under pressure. The letter read, "My darling Eleanor, if you are reading this, then life has taken a turn I would never have wanted for you. There are people who may use your youth and silence against you. Please know this, your voice matters. Your name matters. You are not an ornament to be placed in someone else's house. Trust your instincts. Find the people who still believe in truth. And never let anyone own your name. With all my love, Dad." I sat on the floor for a long time after that, not crying, just holding the paper against my chest as if the ink might still carry his warmth. That night, I returned to my room and lit a candle, not for prayer, but for promise. I would find those names, I would speak again, and I would make sure that silence no longer ruled this house. The first time I saw him, he was kneeling in the dirt with his head bowed like someone in prayer. It was early spring, the kind where the air still bites, but the birds are starting to believe again. The old garden, the one behind the kitchen wing, had been left to wither for years. Weeds tangled over the stone paths. The rose bushes had long surrendered. The soil had gone dry, cracked like old skin. No one had touched it since my mother died. Until that morning. I was passing by the back hallway window when I saw movement slow, careful, deliberate. I stopped, pressed my fingertips to the glass. There was a man there. Mid-30s, maybe a little older. His hair was dark, curled slightly at the back, and he wore a threadbare flannel over rolled sleeves. Dirt streaked his forearms. A small canvas bag lay beside him full of bulbs and tools. He moved like he wasn't afraid of silence, like he had spent time alone and made peace with it. I didn't know his name then, just that he was new. The next day, he was there again, tending the soil, removing old roots, humming under his breath. I asked Martha who he was. She said, "A gardener finally. Richard hired him. The grounds were beginning to look neglected." She didn't offer a name. She rarely did unless it was someone who mattered. But something about him made the air in the house feel different. Not warmer exactly, but less stale. On the third day, I left the library and walked toward the garden. I didn't plan to. My feet just carried me there, as if my body remembered the path long after my mind had forgotten. He didn't notice me at first. I watched him gently replant an iris, his hands working with quiet reverence. When he finally looked up, his eyes were the first surprise, clear gray, but soft. Not invasive. He didn't flinch. Didn't straighten suddenly like the others had when they saw me. He just nodded. "Morning," he said. I nodded back, unsure if I should speak. He didn't press, just returned to his task. That was the beginning. Over the next few days, I visited more often. Always silently. Sometimes I brought tea, left it on the stone bench. Sometimes I sat across from him watching as he coaxed green life out of the ruin. On the 5th visit, he finally said, "You're not much of a talker, are you?" I opened my mouth, closed it, shrugged. He didn't laugh, just nodded again. "That's all right. Plants don't talk much either." That made me smile barely. But it was the first time my lips had curved upward in months. "My name's David," he added. "David Harlan. But everyone just calls me Harlan." I almost said mine aloud, almost. But instead, I reached into my pocket, pulled out a small notebook, and wrote 3 words. "My name's Eleanor." He took the notebook gently, read it, smiled. "Nice to meet you, Eleanor." And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I believed someone meant it. David didn't ask questions, not the kind that needed immediate answers. Instead, he made observations. "You like roses?" I nodded. "Any favorites?" I thought for a moment, then scribbled the white ones. "They bruise easiest, but last longest." He read it carefully, then said, "Sounds like someone I just met." I blushed. He treated me like a person, not an invalid, not a ghost, not a burden. And he never looked over his shoulder when talking to me. That mattered. One day I asked where he came from. He paused, his trowel still in the soil. "Up north, small town, lost someone, needed dirt and silence for a while." I didn't press. We shared that understanding grief that didn't require explanation. Pain that didn't shout. That afternoon, I brought him a book, The Secret Garden. I handed it to him like a gift too fragile to wrap. He turned it over in his hands. "For me," I nodded. He didn't thank me with words. Just sat down beside me and read the first page aloud. His voice was low, steady, and warm. The kind of voice you don't mind getting lost in. I didn't write anything that day. I just listened. Julian noticed eventually. He began asking offhand questions at dinner, his fork tapping in rhythm. "Why the sudden interest in topiary? Gardens bore you, don't they?" I said nothing. He smirked. "Careful, Eleanor. Some seeds shouldn't be watered." I excused myself. That night, I found one of my books missing. The one I had hidden behind the Russian novels, The Second Life of Eleanor Whitmore. In its place was a single note: "First lives don't always get second chances. Be wise." No signature, but it didn't need one. Still, I didn't stop visiting the garden. I became bolder, leaving notes for David in the tool shed. Little things, quotes, drawings, questions. He'd leave his answers on note cards tucked into flower pots. We developed a language of our own. He told me about his sister who died too young, about a marriage that didn't survive the silence afterward, about learning to make peace with things you can't fix. I told him slowly through writing about the locked house, the paper-thin marriage, the voice I once had. He never offered pity, only presence. One cloudy morning, as he trimmed the climbing vines near the fence, I wrote, "Why are you still here in this place?" He read the question, looked at me, then said quietly, "Because you are." I didn't cry, not then. But that night, I sat in the library and wept. Not from sadness, from recognition. Someone had seen me and not looked away, and for the first time since childhood, I felt like I had roots again. Even if they were growing in secret, some things don't want to stay buried. It was a Tuesday. The kind of gray, low-hanging morning that makes the trees look tired. I had been helping David in the garden, not with tools, but with presence. I'd sit nearby handing him things, writing little notes sometimes, reading aloud when the wind was quiet enough. We had started clearing out the oldest corner of the garden, the southeast plot beneath the broken sundial. That corner had always felt different. It was where my mother used to plant herbs, lavender, thyme, sage. After she died, it had grown wild, then hard, then forgotten. David knelt in the soil, working on uprooting a section of overgrown mint that had swallowed the brick lining. I was brushing dirt from a cracked terracotta shard when his trowel struck something solid. He stopped, frowned, dug carefully with his hands. I crouched beside him, heart fluttering for no reason I could name. At first, I thought it was a rock, but then I saw the edge of a torn ribbon, dark green, muddy, but unmistakably fabric. David pulled gently. Out came a tin box, small, rusted at the hinges, dented on one side. It looked like something meant to hold cigars. Or secrets. He looked at me. "Yours," he said softly, placing it in my lap. My hands shook. I opened it slowly, afraid the years might have eaten away the contents. But inside, wrapped in faded wax paper, was a thick envelope, creased and water-stained, but intact. On the front, in my father's handwriting, to be opened only by Eleanor, no one else. I sat back on my heels. The earth seemed to tilt beneath me. David said nothing. He just turned away slightly, giving me the kind of privacy you don't have to ask for when someone truly sees you. I peeled the envelope open with care. Inside were several folded documents tied with a blue ribbon and a short letter written in my father's steady hand. "My Eleanor, if this has found you, then I fear what I worried might come to pass has become real." I had hoped the copies kept in the study would suffice, but something in me knew I should keep another version safe somewhere. Only you would find it. "This box belonged to your mother. She once hid love notes to me in it, buried under the time patch." That felt fitting. "Enclosed are the original terms of your inheritance, unsigned but initialed, and a personal letter from me to Judge M.F. Landry, a dear friend, who may be your last defense if things have been taken from you. You are not property. You are not a pawn. You are your mother's daughter and my greatest pride. Do not be afraid. There are still people who believe in truth. And if they try to silence, you find another way to speak. All my love, Dad." I didn't cry. I couldn't. Not yet. I handed the letter to David. He read it silently, brow furrowed, lips tightening at the corners. Then he whispered, "It's enough to start something." We didn't speak more that morning. We just sat there, two figures in the dirt, as if the garden itself had chosen to bloom something new. That evening, I returned to the library and opened the tin again. I laid out each page a notarized draft of a trust in my name, a power of attorney that had never been enacted, and the letter to Judge Landry typed signed, dated just 1 week before my parents' accident. None of it matched the paperwork Richard had ever shown me. David came in quietly, closing the door behind him. "We need help," he said. I nodded. "There's a woman I know. Used to be legal aid in Hartford. She's discreet, smart, not afraid of people like your uncle." He said her name was Marianne Frost. 48, widowed. Had once defended a whistleblower in a corporate case that almost cost her license. But she won. "She owes me a favor," he added a little wryly. "Don't ask." I smiled for the first time that day. Within a week, Marianne arrived. She came in through the back entrance, dressed plainly, hair pulled back, eyes sharp. We met in the old greenhouse, now more glass than life, but still private. She took one look at the documents and said, "This is enough for a court order to freeze their access, at least temporarily, but I'll need your testimony." I hesitated. She saw it. "Or your written statement, your story, as much as you can give." That night I wrote. For 5 hours, I poured everything into 10 pages of lined notebook paper. The silence, the stolen mail, the forced marriage, the fear, the longing, the slow erosion of self. I didn't write like a victim. I wrote like a witness. David stayed nearby, not reading, not pressing, just there. When I finished, I handed it to Marianne. She read in silence. Then she looked up and said, "This will make them tremble." Julian knew something had changed. He saw it in the way I stood, in the way I looked him in the eye at breakfast. "You're louder without speaking," he muttered once. I smiled politely. "Silence isn't weakness. You just never learned to listen." That was the last time we spoke casually. A month later, Marianne filed the petition. An emergency injunction was granted to restrict access to the estate until full review. Richard erupted. Martha wept for show. Julian looked at me like someone watching the ground crack beneath their wheels. But I stood tall. I wasn't done. I was just beginning. Because in the roots of an old garden, something had stirred. And this time, it had teeth. I used to think courtrooms were only for people who had done something wrong. Criminals, thieves, people in orange jumpsuits and handcuffs. Not girls who grew up in houses with rose gardens and leather-bound books. But there I was, sitting in a plain wooden chair beneath fluorescent lights that buzzed just enough to fray your thoughts, facing a panel of strangers who held pieces of my life in manila folders. The hearing wasn't held in a grand courthouse, just a modest family court building tucked behind a post office in Brantford. No press, no spectators. Just the sound of shuffling papers, coughing attorneys, and the low murmur of law. David sat behind me. I could feel his steadiness like a warmth through my spine. Marianne sat beside me, calm and coiled like a spring ready to defend, challenge, protect. Across the aisle, Richard wore his best suit. Martha sat beside him, dabbing her eyes, though nothing had happened yet. And Julian, well... Julian just smirked, as if this were another one of his private games, and he already knew the outcome. But something had shifted. I wasn't the girl they'd silenced anymore. I was a woman who had found her voice in the roots of a garden. The judge was a woman. That surprised me. Her name was Honorable Margaret F. Landry. Yes, that Landry. The same one my father had written to. Marianne had managed to get the letter directly into her chambers 2 days before the hearing. She glanced at me when she entered, not long, but long enough that I saw recognition in her eyes. And something else. Regret. Or maybe resolve. We began. Marianne opened with clarity and force. Your Honor, we contend that the marriage between Eleanor Whitmore and Julian Whitmore was arranged under conditions of coercion, psychological manipulation, and without informed consent. We have documentation supporting an orchestrated campaign to isolate, silence, and delegitimize Ms. Whitmore's autonomy, both as an individual and as an heir. She laid out the timeline, the evidence, the hidden documents found in the garden, the journals, the withheld letters. She cited psychiatric reports commissioned under false pretenses, testimony from a dismissed housemaid, and my own written statement, 10 pages of quiet fire. Then it was Richard's turn. He stood slowly, carefully. Your Honor, he began, voice smooth, practiced. It is deeply painful to find oneself on this side of a proceeding involving family. I cared for Eleanor as my own after the tragic loss of her parents. Any actions I took were in service of her protection. He turned toward me then, actually turned. Eleanor, you were fragile. You hardly spoke. You refused meals, refused contact. We did what we believed was best to protect your future. Judge Landry interjected. Was she ever presented with legal alternatives to marriage? Richard faltered. We sought to ensure stability. Was she ever given legal counsel? She wasn't in a state. Was she ever asked Mr. Whitmore? Silence. Then Julian rose. If I may, Your Honor, he said, voice silky as oil. This entire circus is built on her revisionist memory. Eleanor was not chained. She wasn't forced into anything. We all made sacrifices, including me. I looked at him then, long and quiet. And for the first time, I spoke in that room. She was never asked, I said. The words dropped like a stone into water. Murmurs rippled. Marianne smiled. I looked straight at Judge Landry. My voice wasn't missing, I continued. It was taken, and every time I tried to use it, they changed the locks. Julian opened his mouth, but the judge raised her hand. Thank you, Ms. Whitmore, she said. She turned back to the attorneys. I have read every line of the evidence, and while this is a hearing, not a trial, I must determine whether there is sufficient basis to recommend annulment proceedings and to order immediate protective relief. She paused, looked around the room. Based on what I've read and what I've heard today, the answer is yes. Martha gasped. Richard turned pale. Julian's jaw clenched. The judge continued. Effective immediately, Ms. Whitmore's marital union with Julian Whitmore is to be suspended under emergency provision until full annulment proceedings can be completed. Furthermore, control of the Whitmore estate shall return to Ms. Whitmore pending fiduciary review. The court will appoint an independent trustee to assist in transition. She looked at me again, then said something I'll never forget. Ms. Whitmore, I am sorry we failed you for so long. I didn't cry, but I nodded, because I forgave her, and because the words mattered more than I had expected. Outside the courtroom, the sky was still overcast, but I swear the light had changed. The air felt thinner. Less like a cage, more like a threshold. David stood beside me, his hand just brushing mine. "You did it," he said. I shook my head. "We did it." He smiled, then added, "So, what now?" I looked up at the courthouse, at the people walking past, unaware that something had just shifted inside one quiet woman forever. I think I said slowly, "It's time I unlocked the rest of the doors in that house." And I meant it, because silence may have been my story, but not my ending. The first door I opened was mine, not the new guest room they had moved me into, not the cold beige chamber that smelled of starch and submission. No, the room I had grown up in. The one with lavender wallpaper faded from sunlight and a single stubborn crack in the windowsill that I used to tuck little notes into when I was angry or afraid. It took some effort. The door had swollen from disuse, the hinges resisting like something ashamed to welcome me back. But when it finally creaked open, the scent hit me. Dust. Time. And beneath it all, lilacs. My mother's perfume lingered on the edge of the old quilt folded at the foot of the bed. The same one she had sewn with her own hands, each square, made from scraps of dresses, tablecloths, and curtains. I ran my palm along the worn fabric. A ripple of memory surged: bedtime stories, sleepy lullabies, the warmth of a nightlight left on just a little too long. I sat on the edge of the mattress, let the quiet settle. It didn't feel like a room anymore. It felt like a wound trying to heal. The second door I opened was the parlor, the one Richard used for meetings and fabricated civility. It was always too cold, too pristine. A room designed to impress, not to live in. But now it was empty. No more dark leather briefcases. No more hushed conversations behind partially closed doors. No more charts about assets or charts of my behavior. I stood in the center of the rug, the heavy curtains still drawn, and let the silence speak. I whispered aloud, "I am not a transaction." And the words echoed, like truth. The third door was harder. The one at the end of the hallway, the locked study. It had once been my father's. After his death, Richard had claimed it like a predator marking territory. The key had been changed, the furniture rearranged. But now, after the court's decision, the house and everything within it was mine to enter. Marianne had arranged for a locksmith. It took less than a minute to undo what years of deceit had secured. When the door finally clicked open, I stepped inside. At first glance, it looked the same. The mahogany desk, the green banker's lamp, the tall shelves stretching to the ceiling. But the air felt wrong, sterile, rearranged. Like someone had tried to rewrite history with a vacuum and polish. Still, I found the drawer he had hidden the original claws in. I found the books my father had once read to me, though most had been moved to less visible places. And tucked in the back corner of the lowest cabinet behind a false panel, I found a small velvet pouch containing my mother's locket. I opened it. Inside, a photo of her holding me, barely 3 years old, wrapped in a blanket embroidered with the word beloved. My knees gave out. I sat on the floor and sobbed, not because of sorrow, but because someone once had loved me enough to leave breadcrumbs home. From that day forward, I opened one door each morning. Not literal ones only, though I did open every locked space in the manor. Eventually linen closets, attic trunks, even the cellar no one had entered in years. But I also opened doors inside myself. Memory, voice, desire. The desire to be seen not as a possession, not as someone fragile, but as someone becoming. David returned often. Not as a gardener anymore, though the roses began to bloom again under his care. He came as a friend. Sometimes we sat in the solarium. Sometimes we read together in the library, each with a book, but sharing the silence like it was music. Once I caught him standing in the doorway of the music room where my old piano had sat untouched for years. He turned and said, "You ever play?" I shook my head. He said, "Maybe it's time." That afternoon, I opened the piano lid and pressed a single key. It rang, unsteady, sharp, but true. Julian never returned. Richard filed appeals, but lost them. Martha sent one letter, thinly veiled regret wrapped in performative affection. I never replied. Some silences are earned. Some doors should remain closed. One afternoon in early autumn, Judge Landry visited. She arrived without warning, dressed in civilian clothes, no court escort. We had tea on the terrace. She looked out at the garden, then at me. "You remind me of your mother," she said. "Not in looks, in backbone." I smiled. She had more courage than I ever realized. "You have your own kind," she replied. Quieter, but no less steady. Before she left, she handed me a folder. Inside was her signed recommendation for formal annulment and a statement affirming my sole authority over the estate. "You don't need to hide anymore," she said gently. "The law sees you now." But I had already stopped hiding. Long before the signatures, long before the papers. I had begun the moment I opened that first door. That night, I sat in the garden with a candle and my journal. I wrote, "Doors can keep things out, but they can also let things in light wind the smell of thyme and wild roses. And sometimes, if you're lucky, they let you walk out." It didn't happen all at once. There was no great moment of revelation, no grand speech delivered beneath chandeliers or on courtroom steps. No trembling crescendo where I rose to my feet and declared myself reborn. It happened slowly, like spring thawing through frost, like breath returning after a long sob. The first sound I made wasn't even a word. It was a laugh. A small one, barely audible, but real. David had told a story. Something about a goat, a rainstorm, and a pair of ruined boots. I had been sipping tea, watching his hands as he animated the tale, and then it slipped from me. A single breath caught and cracked at the edge. A laugh. He paused, looked at me, smiled, not surprised, not startled, just warm. "Nice sound," he said quietly. "Missed it." I hadn't even realized it was mine. From there, it began to bloom slowly, softly. A word here, a name there. I practiced in the garden when no one was around. Whispered the names of flowers like incantations: camellia, hyacinth, marigold. I recited lines from old poems I had memorized as a girl. Emily Dickinson first, then Frost, then Keats. Their words were safer than my own. They had been spoken before, carried no danger. At night, I hummed lullabies to myself, melodies I thought I had forgotten. The notes were unsteady, thin, like the voice of a ghost returning from someplace far, but each one stitched something back together. One morning, I stood at the mirror and tried a simple phrase. "My name is Eleanor." It came out rough. The R caught in my throat like gravel. I tried again, clearer, more certain. "My name is Eleanor." I felt tears rise, but they didn't fall. They just shimmered in place. The first person I truly spoke to was David. We were sitting on the stone bench beneath the willow tree. He was reading aloud from a gardening journal something about soil composition and late bloomers. I placed my hand on his knee. He stopped. I turned to him and said, "You make things grow?" His eyes widened, not with shock, but with something closer to reverence. "I try," he said softly. "So do you." That was the first full sentence I had spoken aloud in years. It didn't feel like a declaration. It felt like an opening. Marianne came by a few days later with legal papers to finalize the annulment. She handed me a pen. "You don't need to say anything," she said gently. "But if you want to, I'm here." I looked at her and said, "Thank you for believing me before I could say a word." She blinked, smiled. Her fingers trembled as she passed me the final page. "I always knew you'd speak," she said. "I didn't," I replied, "until I did." But healing wasn't just about sound. It was about claiming space, owning it. I began meeting with a local therapist recommended by Marianne, who specialized in selective mutism and trauma. Dr. Rivera. She had eyes like rain, quiet, steady, inevitable. At first, we just sat in silence. She let it stretch, never rushing me. Then she handed me a small recorder. "Talk to yourself," she said. "You don't have to play it back. You don't even have to keep it. Just begin." So I did. I recorded memories, questions, confessions. One night, I recorded the phrase, "I wasn't broken. I was paused." I kept that one, played it back, cried, then smiled. People in town began to notice. When I walked into the florist's shop and said, "3 bundles of lavender," please, the woman behind the counter nearly dropped her scissors. When I greeted the postman with a soft morning, he tipped his cap like I was royalty. The stories had circulated, of course. Everyone had heard something about the silent girl in the manor house, the mysterious marriage, the court case. But no one knew the whole truth, and I didn't owe it to them. But I owed something to myself. So I started writing my own version. Not as a legal document, not even as a novel, just a record of the girl who lost her voice and the woman who found it again. In July, the local library invited me to speak at a community reading. The organizer, a kind-faced woman named Clara, knew Marianne and had heard about my case. "I know public speaking may not be your thing," she said, "but even a few words would mean so much to our girls." I almost declined. But then I thought of myself at 17, sitting by the window in my old room, pressing a flower between the pages of a book, afraid to speak and afraid not to. I owed her something too, so I said yes. The night of the event, I stood behind a simple wooden podium, my hands trembling slightly. The small audience was quiet, expectant. I looked out, saw a row of girls in the front, maybe 16, 17, eyes wide, notebooks open in their laps. I took a breath, closed my eyes, and began. Once I lived in a house where silence was expected. Once I believed silence was the only safe place left. But silence, I've learned, is not peace. It's a door, and I opened it. The room held still. Then came the sound of clapping, slow, gentle, then rising. I stepped back, smiled. David was waiting in the wings. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He just took my hand. And I knew my voice had returned, not just to my throat, but to my life. And this time, I wasn't giving it up. There's something sacred about a letter no one will ever read. It carries no demand for reply, no performance of forgiveness or defense. Only truth. Raw, unpolished, and untouched by the hands of time. In the weeks after my voice returned, I began writing letters, not to send, but to release, each one addressed to a ghost. Some were gone by death, some by distance, some by silence deeper than mine had ever been. I kept them in a wooden box lined with velvet, one I found in my mother's old wardrobe beneath a stack of scarves she had embroidered when I was still small enough to sit at her feet and listen to the hum of her sewing machine. I wrote the first letter on a rainy morning, the kind of rain that makes you still inside. The kind that asks you to remember. Dear Mama, do you remember how I used to fall asleep with your perfume on my pillow? Do you remember the lullaby you hummed low and steady until I melted into sleep? There are days I still think I hear it woven into wind or drifting between the pages of your books. I wonder what you would have done had you seen what they did to me after you left. Would you have fought for me? Or would you have assumed, as others did, that silence meant safety? I try not to blame you for dying. But Mama, it was hard without your hands. Harder without your voice reminding me that mine mattered. I found your locket. I wear it now. Some days I pretend you're still inside it. Still watching. Still proud. I hope I've made you proud. Love, Eleanor. The second letter was harder. I rewrote it 3 times, but in the end, I kept the first draft. Because truth doesn't always wear good grammar. Dear Julian, no, I won't call you husband. You never were. You were an agreement, a contract signed with quiet threats, a prison disguised in silk gloves and brittle smiles. You told yourself I was fragile, that I needed care, that you were doing me a favor by giving me a place. But I was not yours to place. I was not yours to name. And I will never again be anyone's ghost to keep. I used to think you were cruel. Now I think you were lonely. I pity that. But I do not excuse it. You told me once silence is power if you know how to wield it. You were wrong. Silence is survival. Voice is power. And I have mine now. Goodbye, Eleanor. The next letter was to someone I would never meet again. But somehow he was always with me. Dear Papa, you were the first voice I ever trusted. I remember the way you'd lower your book at bedtime and say, "Just one more page," even when we both knew it would be 3 more chapters. You taught me that stories mattered, and that I could be one too. They tried to erase your words, your papers, your intentions, your plans for me. But they forgot one thing. You had hidden them in me too. In the way I remembered the cadence of your voice, in the values you left tucked between chapters in tea. I found the envelope, Papa, the one in the garden. You knew I would. I hope that means you knew I'd find myself too. I wish you could see me now. I think you'd smile. Still turning pages, Eleanor. But the letter that stayed in my hand the longest, the one that almost didn't get written, was to the girl I once was. The one I had avoided. The one I had mourned. The girl who walked corridors like a shadow and hid whole lifetimes behind the curve of her lips. I thought I had lost her, but she had waited for me all this time. Dear me, age 17 in the window seat. I see you. Not just the outline of your face or the fall of your hair. I see the way your hands tremble when you hold the pen. I see the way your heart beats against your ribs when the door creaks. I see how you write your name on the inside cover of every book, not because you fear losing them, but because you fear losing yourself. I know you're tired. I know you think no one will come. But hear me, you came. You saved us. With every page you wrote in hiding, with every breath you took when it would have been easier to disappear. You planted seeds even when the garden was ash. And now it's blooming. You don't need to be brave anymore. You can just be, and that is more than enough. Love always me. After I sealed the letters, I didn't burn them. I buried them under the oldest tree in the garden. I dug the hole with my own hands, dirt beneath my fingernails, breath-steady eyes full of wind. And when the box was lowered, I whispered aloud, "You are forgiven." Not for the harm, but for the holding on. Because letting go, I've learned, isn't forgetting. It's remembering without chains. And that is a kind of freedom silence could never offer. It was never locked. That surprised me most. All this time, I had imagined it bolted, rusted shut, or sealed by some invisible force like all the others. But when I reached for the brass handle of the front door, the one that faced east toward the winding drive, and the world beyond it turned easily in my palm. No creak, no resistance, only air, and the faint smell of magnolia. It had been years since I walked through that door. Not just past it, not just peered through its windows. Walked through it, on my own terms. I woke early that morning, long before the sun breached the tree line. The house was still the kind of stillness that no longer frightened me. It had shifted over time from silence imposed to silence chosen. I bathed, brushed my hair, and put on the pale blue dress that once belonged to my mother. I found it in an old trunk weeks earlier, carefully folded beneath tissue and lavender sachets. The stitching was delicate but strong like her. I wore no jewelry, no makeup, just the weight of knowing that I had endured. And now I would begin. David was already in the garden when I stepped outside. He stood beneath the willow, pruning gently, as he always did. He turned when he heard me, paused, then smiled. "You're leaving," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. He walked toward me, gloves in hand. I knew this would come. I looked at him, this man who had seen me in my quietest days and never tried to fill the silence. "I'm not running," I said softly, just stepping forward. His eyes didn't waver. "I never thought you were running," he said. "You stayed far longer than most would have." I looked down at my hands, at the key I held. I thought I needed to fix this place, redeem it somehow. "You did more than that," he said. "You gave it truth." I smiled. "I'm not sure what's next," I admitted. "That's the best kind of next." He reached into his pocket and handed me a folded piece of paper. "For the road," he said. I didn't open it then, just held it close. Then, with a long exhale, I turned and walked toward the manor's grand entryway, its double doors tall and elegant, framed by ivy that had begun to climb again. The key was only a formality. The lock turned easily. And when I opened the door, the morning light poured in, filling the foyer like honey. I stepped out barefoot. The gravel was cool beneath my feet. The breeze smelled of lilac and clay. The sky was soft with new sun. And I walked. Down the front steps, past the stone gate, through the path lined with wildflowers that had seeded themselves since the gardeners left. Each step was unfamiliar. Each step was free. I reached the edge of the hill by mid-morning. It overlooked the town, a quilt of roofs and chimneys, sleepy streets, and small lives lived in full color. I sat beneath a birch tree and opened David's note. It read, "You once said silence was survival. Now let your voice be a compass. Wherever you go, say your name often. And don't forget, your story began in a locked house. But it doesn't end there. D." I folded the note carefully, placed it in my pocket next to my mother's locket. Then I leaned back and let the wind brush my cheek like a blessing. I don't know where I'll go yet. Maybe a cottage by the sea? Maybe a city where no one knows my name yet? Maybe somewhere with children's laughter and a piano in need of tuning? But I do know this. The house no longer owns me. The silence no longer defines me. The past no longer imprisons me. And the last door? It opened to something I never thought I'd find again. A life I choose, my own.